All right, our next reading in the prophet Hosea is chapter 3, and it is 5 verses in total, so we will read the whole thing. Verse 1 of chapter 3. And Yahweh said to me, Go again, love a woman who is loved by another man, and is an adulteress, even as Yahweh loves the children of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love cakes of raisins. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver, and a homer and a lethech of barley. And I said to her, You must dwell as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore, or belong to another man. So will I also be to you. For the children of Israel shall dwell many days, without king or prince, without sacrifice or pillar, without ephod or household gods. Afterward the children of Israel shall return and seek Yahweh Elohim, the Lord their God, and David their king, and they shall come in fear to Yahweh and to his goodness in the latter days. Well, it may sound weird or contradictory to say this, but love in our culture today has been over-romanticized. I know we think romance is just another term for what happens between two people that love each other, but you can over-romanticize anything. You can think about some new job opportunity and think, oh, it's going to be perfect, it's going to be easy work, I'm going to love every day, I'm just going to waltz into the workplace and just be in love with everything. Or, oh, I met this girl on a cruise ship and it's just perfect, it's like we're in a movie together, those sorts of things. We over-romanticize things in life, and love, especially between a couple, a man and a woman, has been over-romanticized. We're trained by movies and TV to go out into the world and meet someone whose looks, beliefs, and financial stability, and whatever else, will be up to our standards or our wildest dreams. True love, in the eyes of many, is supposed to be like living on a cruise ship, like I said, or a scenic and never-ending honeymoon filled with posting about your fancy dates on social media, and everybody wishing they could be you. Well, I think it's true that love could be that glamorous, but most of us grow up or have a few bad experiences with people and realize that true love isn't just that, and it's not that most of the time. In the Bible, specifically in this chapter of Hosea, we learn that true love often looks less like buying your spouse a ridiculously expensive gift and more like buying your spouse back out of slavery. I know we don't really have to do all that literally in today's world, but we could equate this to being with the one you love in their lowest moments and helping them out of it. In fact, if we look at marriage honestly, because we're so wrecked by sin, there are times when your actions and attitude towards your spouse will be unloving. And this person, your spouse, whom you're supposed to love, will not always do exactly what you want them to, and vice versa. They won't be easy to love all the time, and you might question, well, what's the benefit of me being in this relationship? Well, in that scenario, Jesus would remind us that if you only love and do good for those who love and do good to you, what good is that? That's what he says in Luke 6, verse 32, that even unbelievers do that. They love people who love them back. They do good to people who can do good for them. James, I believe, addresses that too. Rich people coming into the church, and you see them as an opportunity to get something from them. So you treat them nicely because of what they can supposedly give to you one day. Well, Hosea's wife, Gomer, was a whore. And we don't know all the explicit details of her sinful ways, but it might be helpful to ask some questions. There's a chance that maybe she wanted as many men, as many lovers as she could have, And she was perhaps the type of girl who just couldn't limit herself to only one man. We hear of this today. It's usually the opposite. Men who just say, I'm not going to be tied down. I need to roam free. I'm a stallion. That's how some men who are full of themselves talk, and they just say, well, I can't tie myself down to one woman. It's possible that Gomer was that, but maybe she felt like she had no choice to live a life of whoredom. Maybe a string of bad decisions had led her down a road where she had no money, no husband, and no place to stay. So she turned to selling sex to a different man every night as a way to have all that. Now, either way, her actions are not right. Gomer's promiscuous ways were absolutely sinful. And nevertheless, she had developed this terrible habit of sleeping around. And even though Hosea took her and married her in chapter 1, she eventually went right back to that life. This is what sinners do, folks. Peter describes it like a freshly bathed pig returning to the mud. You go read 2 Peter 2, verse 22. He talks about how a pig, or a sow, the word is like the old King James. You give it a bath, and then what does it do? It's a pig. It goes right back to the mud. Or a dog who throws up and then comes along and sniffs it, and sometimes will lick up its own vomit. If you've had dogs, you might have experienced that before. This is what sinners do. They return to the things that got them dirty. It's even true about those of us who have experienced God's goodness. We still have a tendency to run away from him. But what you'll see in this passage as we continue to look at it is that both God and Hosea are still there to receive the ones who left. And if Gomer is going back to her cheating ways, and if Israel keeps running away from God time and time again, Hosea and Yahweh plan to get back to work on loving them. And we see this starting in verse 1, where it says, Yahweh said to me, go again, love a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress, even as Yahweh loves the children of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love cakes of raisins. Now, those are two interesting things to equate as sins, right? Turning to other gods and loving raisins. It just, on the surface, we're like, what's going on? And if your spouse loved raisins, just loved raisins, you could get past that. I mean, sure, it's a strange craving, but to each his own, right? But what none of us want is a husband or wife who's in love with someone else, another person. However, this is exactly the situation God tells Hosea to get himself into here in chapter 3, verse 1. And if God is telling Hosea to do this, we automatically know it's something God does and is willing to do. It's not like he's going to say, hey, Hosea, do something that's so loving that not even I would do it, right? That's not what's going on here. Obviously, we know if God is telling Hosea to do this, it's because the Lord himself does it. The love that Hosea will need to show to this woman is parallel to the love that God shows to sinners. That's what I'm getting at. And love is the key word here. The first time Yahweh told Hosea to go take a wife. This time the wording is more specific. Go love a woman. It's not that Hosea didn't have to selflessly love Gomer before. After all, he married this woman who no one else would have wanted. It's that this time, the love required on Hosea's part would need to be even greater. In chapter 1, he's getting together with a promiscuous woman, right? He's taking a bride who has a terrible reputation. But in chapter 3, he's taking back the woman who cheated on him. It's personal now. Just make this story relatable to you by thinking about if you were going to start dating someone and they had had many partners previously. You could get past it. That was before they met you. That was before this was a thing. But imagine if you had discovered that while you were together with them, they were out running around with all kinds of lovers. That's more personal. That's more painful. And it's much harder to get past. That's what Hosea is doing. Now, I want to clear something up. It's not said explicitly, but I think we can gather that this woman in chapter 3 is still Gomer from chapter 1. Reason being, no name of a new woman is mentioned. Okay, and given that Gomer's name is mentioned outright in chapter 1, I would think that if Gomer left, it would make mention of that. And if a new woman came into the picture, we would get her name as well. And you might ask, well, how come it doesn't say, Hosea, go love your wife? And it says, go love a woman. Well, I think that's just similar to how God said about Israel that she was not my wife in chapter 2. It's just borrowing that language that parallels the relationship between Hosea and Gomer and God and Israel. Now, I know Hosea marrying a new woman might be a nice parallel for God's love and acceptance of the church, Gentiles, but I think we should just stick with what's written and what we know for sure. And no other woman is mentioned here. I think it follows that it is Gomer. Well, what does Hosea get in return for his love of Gomer? For taking back this wife who ran out on him? Does this woman love Hosea? No, the prophet says she loves raisin cakes. Now, obviously, there's something more to Israel's snacking habits, and we can assume Gomer's snacking habits. What's going on here is far more than just satisfying a craving. Raisin cakes were connected to special occasions in the Old Testament. I want you to see that. It's kind of a celebratory snack. In 2 Samuel 6, the Ark of the Covenant returns to the land, and it says that distributed among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, that is, both men and women, was a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins to each one. So they're having a huge celebration because the Ark of the Covenant was so central to who they were, and they include cakes of raisins. There's also evidence that cakes like these were included in pagan worship. Jeremiah 7 tells us this in verse 18. The children gather wood, the fathers kindle fire, and the women knead dough to make cakes for the queen of heaven, and they pour out drink offerings to other gods to provoke me to anger. So these kinds of baked goods were involved in idol worship. It's almost like a weirder version of baking cookies for Santa. Now, raisins are also mentioned in Solomon's Song of Songs, which I know I don't quote often, but I think this is just an interesting tidbit. And it's in verse 5 of chapter 2, Song of Solomon. Sustain me with raisins, refresh me with apples, for I am sick with love. Sustain me with raisins. Raisins mentioned there in Song of Solomon, which means that raisins were in some way connected to sexual activity. Well, get this. Today, raisins are considered to be what's called an aphrodisiac, which that fancy word comes from the Greek goddess of love, Aphrodite. And what an aphrodisiac is, it's a food that's believed to increase sexual desire. So apparently raisins make the cut. I believe some others are oysters and dark chocolate, but apparently raisins are in here as well. And so given that back in chapter 1 I discussed that part of Baal worship was some sort of sex ritual, you'd go sacrifice an offering to a statue and then you'd sleep with a temple prostitute. Given all that, I think you can now start to understand and imagine why raisins were involved in Israel's pagan practices and Gomer's, likely her profession as a prostitute. But even though Gomer loves her sinful life and Israel has become unfaithful, God and Hosea's love just won't seem to stop. God is faithful despite the ongoing reality that his people are a bunch of sinners. But this is not a message we seem to hear often. This certainly is not our natural way of thinking. The typical view of God is, if you behave yourself, then God will love you and bless you. And why do we believe that? Well, this is how most relationships between sinners work. Mom and dad say, if you behave, then you can have some ice cream. Santa Claus says, if you're nice and not naughty, then you'll get presents under the tree. Your boss says, if you perform all your duties in a timely manner and make little to no mistakes and make the company more money than you cost us, then you'll get a raise. Friends and spouses say, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Do something for me and I'll return the favor. But God does not relate to us in that way. It's not that we loved God, but that he loved us, 1 John 4 says, and sent his son to die for us. John continues, we love because he first loved us. Paul says to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, when we are faithless, he remains faithful. And in Romans 5:8, he says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And while she was being loved by other men, Hosea loved Gomer. And here's how he showed it. Verses 2 and 3. I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a lethek of barley. And I said to her, you must dwell as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore or belong to another man. So will I also be to you. Now, to help us all understand what's being said, let's talk about the amounts in this transaction. 15 shekels, or about 6 ounces of silver, is worth $200 in today's economy. And together, a homer and lethek of barley would weigh over 700 pounds. This amount of grain just so happened to cost about another 15 shekels of silver. That brings the total value of Hosea's purchase of Gomer to 30 pieces of silver. Now, that's an interesting price to pay for a person in many ways. From one point of view, that's an extremely high price. And from another, it's a bargain. If you were making a deal with a Jewish father to marry his daughter, this is something called a dowry, an offer of 30 shekels would be an insult. You're putting that low of a price tag on my daughter, he might say. But if you're buying a slave, this number is a fair price. In fact, if one of your animals, according to the Old Covenant, killed another person's slave, you owed that person 30 pieces of silver. That was the life insurance policy on a person's slave. Now, normally someone would pay a lot in money, grain, or animals to have the rights to marry a woman, but Gomer was a tramp. Her value in the marketplace had plummeted. She might as well have been a slave. And you know what? She was a slave, because sin is slavery. This is something that is all throughout the Bible. Jesus talks about it in John 8. Let's start in verse 31. Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Free from what is the question. And in verse 33, they answered him, we are offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. Which, pause right there. I mean, are these guys like not in tune with their own history? They were slaves in Egypt. They were slaves in Babylon and to the Assyrians. So I don't know like what history they've been following, but the sons of Abraham have been enslaved for like their entire existence. It seems like, at least. Anyway, they continue, how is it that you say you will become free? Because they think they already are free. And Jesus answered them in verse 34, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The son remains forever. So if the son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Sin is slavery. Everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. Romans 6 talks about us being enslaved to sin and slaves of sin. And in 2 Peter 2, I think this is right by the verse about returning to the dog returning to its own vomit, and the pig, after being washed, goes right back to the mud. Yeah, it's in verse 19 talking about false teachers. They promise freedom, but they themselves are slaves of corruption, for whatever overcomes a person, to that he is enslaved. Well, sin is something that overcomes all people. We are all slaves to it. Sin is slavery. Just like Gomer was probably at this point enslaved to some pimp as a prostitute, and Hosea has to go buy her back. And just like the northern kingdom of Israel would become the slaves of the Assyrian Empire, you and I were slaves to sin, and we became worthless, Romans 3 says. No one is good. No one does good. No, not one. All have sinned. Together they become worthless. You will find these, all these truths in Romans 3, as harsh as they may be. And even though we were worthless, Jesus came and bought us with a price, his own blood. And now, of course, how could we get past this mention of a total value of being bought at 30 shekels of silver and not remember that before Jesus paid that price with his own blood, the chief priests paid 30 pieces of silver to Judas to help them arrest Jesus. Well, then Hosea prophesies what happens as a result of God's transaction. There's going to be a time when the Lord says, "You will dwell in the wilderness as mine for many days," speaking of a prolonged stretch of loyalty to the one true God. And just as when a Jew would marry a slave, there was a month-long period of abstinence for them before they consummated the marriage. I think you can see this in Deuteronomy 21, verse 13, but I think it's also here in Hosea. There will be a time when Gomer and also when Israel would quit whoring, and it's used that term, not belonging to a man. And these are all Hosea's commands for Gomer, but simultaneously God's commands for Israel. But within these commands are some great promises. You shall dwell as mine. What's that a promise of? It's a sense of belonging. You are mine. And this will go on for many days, which is a promise of a long-term relationship. Well, in verse 4, it says, "For the children of Israel shall dwell many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or pillar, without ephod or household gods." Not only would the people's sins be taken from them, but even the seemingly good things that they had would be stripped away too. There would be a time when Israel, the northerners in the land, would have no king and live in a land with a completely different government that was not their own. They'd have no temple, no sacrifices, and no priests either. That's what it means when it says ephod. That's something that the priest wears. But along these lines of not having a king or prince, I'm reminded of how some of the Jews told Pontius Pilate in John 19:15, "We have no king but Caesar." Right? And they were saying this as if it were a good thing. But it also doubled as a way of sweet talking the Romans, like, we don't have our separate government. We're a Roman. Caesar is our Lord. So they kind of looked down on this idea of having their own king. But the believing Jews in the Old Testament, to them, having a good king was desirable, especially the future king that was called the Messiah. And we hear about the Messiah in verse 5, where it says, "Afterward the children of Israel shall return and seek Yahweh Elohim, and David their king, and they shall come in fear to the Lord and to his goodness in the latter days. So after this time of lack, there will be a day when God's people do have a king. David will be king. And I know what you're thinking. Isn't David dead today? Yes. And also in the time of Hosea? Yes. Doesn't this prophecy come hundreds of years after David's life? Yes, yes, yes. But the scriptures tell us of someone who is David's son and who lives forever. You can go to Jeremiah 30 and read about this. You can go to Luke 3 when it's giving a genealogy of Jesus' life and it calls him the son of David. Or we're going to look specifically at 3 other places. One is Ezekiel 34, starting in verse 22. I will rescue my flock, and they shall no longer be a prey. And I will judge between sheep, and I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David. And he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David shall be prince among them. I am the Lord, I have spoken. Also in Matthew 21:9, which you can hardly make it throughout the Easter season with hearing this one, so I'm sure it'll be familiar. It says, the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. Son of David. Jesus at his entry into Jerusalem is called the Son of David. People celebrating that the Son of David has come. Also in Mark 10, in a healing story, blind Bartimaeus, it says, and they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside, and when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. So Jesus is the Son of David, and the believing Jews knew that, and they knew it from passages like Hosea 3:5. David, their king, will serve, and they shall come to the Lord in fear and to his goodness in the latter days. And this, of course, is talking about people coming to Jesus in fear, or really that word, it's so much bigger than being scared or anything like that. I think we could translate it as worship. And here's what that looks like. People fearing Jesus, why it happens, and I think it happens in Psalm 130, let's start in verse 3. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, that you may be feared, that you may be worshipped. So Jesus is this king. He does not count sins. He forgives them. And as a result, he is worshipped and feared. I think Hosea comes together with the Psalms, who come together with the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and show us that these things are all found true in Jesus. But when will all this fully and finally happen? Well, Hosea uses words like many days, which is a comforting reminder to remember when we look around in the world, we look at Israel even, or we look at the church, and we don't see a lot of this coming true right this second. In fact, there are a lot of people who might be blood descendants of Israel, and they totally reject Jesus. There are people in the church who do the same. There are people in America who do it. Every country, there are people who are not dwelling as the Lord's for many days. One day there will be a time when people come in fear to the Lord and to his goodness. But it might not be right this second. There are many days involved here, and there are also the latter days. involved, which I think can be understood as the time between Jesus' first and second coming, which is still yet to come, and it is where we are right now. And that is Hosea chapter 3,